motion are we? Sorry. What motion are we debating on?
The second motion on regretting the concept of marriage.
Okay, cool. I guess that settles everything. Best of luck to everyone. I'll wait for OC to give me confirmation for the debate to start. Yeah, please input their vetoes as well. OC, are we good to start? I assume it's recording, so I'll assume it's okay to start. All right, debating on the motion, this house regrets the concept of marriage. Let's now call on Prime Minister, please, you're here.
Can I confirm that I'm clearly audible?
Yes, you're clearly audible.
All right, give me a minute. Okay, POIs in the chats. I'm gonna pull up my timer. Cool. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Government opposition cannot claim that this debate is purely about the concept of marriage and in its pure unadulterated form. They must debate this debate upon the ways in which this concept is manifested upon the world and the benefits and harms that individuals derive from the ways that states have decided to utilize this narrative from the get-go. I want to clear up from the start of this debate what the definition of marriage is in a formal way, and then explain how this manifests into concrete harms onto individuals on the ground, because I know opposition will want to challenge this. The definition of what a marriage is just the idea of a state-sanctioned relationship. That's the idea that there's a body that consummates your relationship, that your relationship is sanctified by an external body, and the value of your relationship and the extent and the state of relationship that you have is determined by someone external to yourself. How has this been implemented by states, and how is this uniquely harmful to individuals on the ground? The first thing I want to point out in characterization is that the state often has interests that are antithetical to that, or to the interests of individuals on the ground. This is because states derive the majority of their power from the individuals on the ground, from individuals having children, from ensuring that these children grow up well and productive, and that they are able to contribute back towards the state, back towards the economy. This therefore means that the state has perverse incentives to do things like explicitly endorsing only heterosexual relationships to ensure that that only, like, for example, that because these are the relationships they're able to produce children, they are the kinds of narratives that encourage states to endorse things like ensuring that women are homemakers, so these children grow up safe and cared for, as opposed to being neglected, right? For example, I want to note here that even though opposition may try to preempt this by saying that this does not apply to the current iteration of states, they still need to deal with the counterfactual that means that this narrative has extended from the beginning of time. So that's to say that when states were initially conceptualized and when the idea of marriage was initially conceptualized, you need to know that these states have historically been traditionalists. We would argue that even today we have states that actively weaponize this kind of narrative because these are states that are actively traditionalist, they are actively conservative. This is incredibly harmful. Why is the narrative of marriage therefore incredibly powerful upon individuals? How does it exert so much force over their lives? We think there are several structural reasons here. The first is that this is reinforced through structures of society. It looks like narratives that mean that that say that your marriage will be the happiest day of your life, that your commitment is cemented at your marriage, at your wedding, for example, that you should not be able to leave this relationship without jumping through multiple hoops because marriage is the ultimate conception of commitment towards a partner. The second reason is because the idea of a marriage and the idea of a nuclear family has been socialized through things like government influences, through things like school, for example, in which teachers tell you what the end goal of your life is. The third reason is because societal norms weigh very heavily in these kinds of debates. The fourth reason is because we think that things like government policy actively have a great deal of legitimacy because this is the body of policy that all individuals have voted for, even though it goes against the interests of certain minorities. We're going to prove why it is harmful later, but all you need to note now is that the way in which this is utilized by the states therefore means that a lot of individuals place a lot of weight upon this narrative. It means that they internalize this as the end point of their relationship. Yes, I'll take the POI.
So like you said, the incentive of states is to get people to have more children. Marriage is just the current mechanism by which they try to achieve that goal. Why is that likely to change, and why are states unlikely to achieve this goal through other means on your side of the house?
If they want to have children, we are perfectly fine with them giving out things like baby bonuses. What we do not support are things like the rigid conception of a nuclear family that they actively indoctrinate into children from gender stereotypes from media, from gender roles from teachers, for example, for a very young age. That's what we oppose. First argument, there is a massive degree of oppression in the ways in which the marriage has been actively manifested upon the world. And here's where I want to define the counterfactual. We think that under outside of the house, individuals are more likely to assert and derive meaning from their relationships through their own intimate memories of this marriage. This looks like, for example, couples who have been together for 50 to 60 years who have an intimate understanding of one another that have never consummated their relationship through marriage. We think that this is likely going to be the manifestation because the only reason why society deems it necessary and they have the capacity to meddle into the intimate relationships of other individuals is because this has been under the purview of the state. When it's under the purview of the state, this means that this is an institution that everyone has input into. When you remove that, this is the tipping point under outside the house. We think that individuals are more likely to consider relationships things like private affairs. So this means that under outside the house, you can still have children, you can still have things like cohabitation, but the ways in which individuals derive value from this relationship is not outsourced to an external body. We think that's far better under outside the house. Oppression. Why does the state actively utilize this narrative in a way that's incredibly harmful? We think that they utilize this narrative in order to do things like not supporting gay marriages because they give baby bonus and they use things like baby bonuses that encourage women to give up their career to have kids. We think that this leads to several concrete harms. The first is that the majority of individuals, insofar as everyone has been indoctrinated into the idea that marriage is the endpoint of all relationships, are unable to access the conception of a concrete relationship. They think that their relationship is aimless. They do not have an endpoint to their relationship because the state does not grant it legitimacy. They do not grant it formalization. We think that we take that away under outside the house when individuals are freer to define the conception of their relationship towards themselves. So they are likely going to define this through things like time, through things like sacrifices, through things like commitment. We think that's far better under outside the house. The second reason is because these kinds of narratives contribute to massive amounts of societal judgment, right? This means that individuals are able to judge the legitimacy and a formalization of someone else's relationship based on whether the state approves of it. We think that this is incredibly harmful because this often leads to massive amounts of shame and massive amounts of discrimination from individuals within your family, their friend circle, and your community. This looks like telling individuals that, hey, you shouldn't be going out. Dating that man, for example, if you're another man, because your goal is to have children, for example. We don't think that that's something that's necessarily good under that side of the house. They need to deal with the massive amounts of concrete harms that this narrative has created throughout history. At the end of this first argument, what they need to deal with is like the ability of individuals to access a greater conception of happiness under outside of the house and the widespread oppression of women. The last thing I want to say here is that often individuals are trapped within these relationships because the idea of commitment the idea of commitment is what is formalizing of the relationship. This is the second argument. The state actively tells individuals that your marriage is important because you put out barriers to exit. We think that this is a ludicrous way for you to view relationships. We do not think trapping another individual through things like legal loopholes, through things like contracts, through things like the mechanism of divorce is the important way in which you're able to quantify how much this relationship means to you. Why is this incredibly oppressive towards women? Because the point in time in which you buy our analysis about how you're actively socializing women, socializing minorities into certain kinds of gender stereotypes that ought to be their ideal life when they get into a relationship is the point in which these individuals, one, lose independence and autonomy. They lose crucial agency because they give up their job because their family has been telling them to have a baby bonus. But second of all, we think that it's far harder for these individuals to leave because they create a dependency upon their partner. We think it's far better under outside of the house. Propose.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much for that speech. Okay. Building the case of the opposition, may now call on the leader of opposition, please.
Can I check if I'm audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Thank you. POIs in chat, please. Starting my speech. Oh, sorry. Opposition paints marriage out to be the state's insidious tool of oppression. We contest the contrary, that marriage actually provides protection and certainty to individuals that opt into the institution of marriage. To win this debate, opposition will aim to prove two things. Firstly, the involvement of the state in these sorts of relationships is necessary and justified. And secondly, people are able to mostly consent well into these relationships of marriage. And even if they don't, the counterfactual on-site government is much worse. I think firstly, again, on the conception of marriage and what exactly it means. It means entering into a relationship that is hard to opt out of because you are bound legally by the state. This is the only thing that is inherent to marriage, because love and commitment, etc., can be found in other relationships, but the permanence that is enforced by the arm of the law is something that differentiates marriage from such relationships. I think secondly, an important characterization to note is that commitment does not come naturally to individuals. Firstly, people usually have the inclination to believe that the grass is greener on the other side. There's a natural longing for things out of your reach. There's always a prospective imagination that something that you don't have could be better than what you have now. I think secondly, people naturally just have a fear of commitment. What is the implication of this, right? These counter narratives ensure that people in society only get married if they really are ready to overcome these natural urges and be committed by someone in a relationship that is recognized by the law. I think the counterfactual on-site government, where you never ever had this conception of marriage to begin with, is that all individual relationships, regardless of the amount of commitment that they feel towards each other, will be classified as a relationship which the state does not intervene in. Therefore, this means that you lose all the legal protections that a status of marriage grants to two individuals that choose to get married. I think firstly and importantly, it's important to notice that marriage binds individuals together legally, which creates a lot of benefits for these people. I think this looks like default healthcare context, for instance, the pooling of assets, or the ability for a wife to act as a guarantor for her husband's loans, for instance. These are all legally recognizable traits that the relationship of marriage grants onto these individuals. I think there are three benefits that accrue from this. Firstly, there's a stability and community support in times of hardship for these individuals. Understand that in familial relationships, you are bound to your parents, and parents are bound to their children in relationships built by law. In the sense that you don't opt into these relationships, they just happen. However, marriage is unique in the sense that it creates these relationships in an opt-in mechanism. What does this mean? It means that support networks will extend naturally past the biological relationships that you inherit. You can choose to be married to your husband, and therefore you choose to enter into your husband's family. Your in-laws now have familial relationships and commitments to you. Therefore, when you are in times of hardship, you generally have more individuals to rely upon. You have more people that care about your well-being. But more importantly and uniquely to side opposition, these individuals are bound by their commitment to you in law, right? This gives people a lot of peace of mind, knowing that the commitment in marriage is unconditional, that their partner will always be there for them, even during times of hardship, and not just their partner, but their partner's relatives, their partner's families and parents, etc., etc. I think secondly and importantly, there's a collective economic benefit to be gleaned from these relationships, right? These benefits look like large investments from the pooling of resources. It's incredibly hard for somebody to, on a single income, buy a house or buy a car or decide to raise their families. Uniquely, marriage being hard to dissolve imbues certainty onto both parties that an investment into this relationship is something that is worth it. It is worth it for me to buy this house with my partner because I know that they cannot default on their obligations to me, that if they choose suddenly to not pay their part of the rent, or they choose to, let's say, not pay the mortgage, that is something that I can enforce against them because they are my partner, and legally they are bound to do these things because we are married. The counterfactual here is that individuals will necessarily be more reluctant when investing into these shared investments, primarily because there's a fear that the other party can easily withdraw commitment, which inhibits individuals from pooling their assets together in the first place. I think this undercuts a lot of benefits, right? For individuals, you get houses and you get cars, you get these big ticket items and investments more easily because you pool resources. But secondly, for the state, it is easier because it reduces the burden on the state to pay for these like housing and cars, etc., etc. It makes things more economically efficient. It allows individuals to achieve the things that they want in life in a more economically efficient way. I think thirdly, we talk about the benefit of children and when they come into the picture. Understand that stability of marriage is very, very important to raise children, because understand that even in relationships where, for example, you have a boyfriend or you have like a one-night stand and you have a child, this person is not legally bound to you. They simply are not able to pay maintenance or alimony. You cannot enforce anything onto them. Marriage allows these individuals to actually gain this sort of monetary benefit from their spouse, even in instances where they decide to get separated. This is something that's necessary for the development of the child and for the child to be raised in an environment that's economically stable. But I think more importantly, we need to prove why people will opt into marriage voluntarily on our side of the house. I think the main contention here is that you never have is that you have imperfect information about a person, and therefore you entering into a legally binding relationship with them is something that is unjustified. But I want to contest this, right? You can never perfectly know somebody, but you can broadly approximate what they are going to be like in the next 10, 20 years. People change, but within a certain band of expectation, right? So in the worst case, if the dissonance between the expectation and reality of what this person was and what they used to be is that large, there is an opt-out mechanism available. Marriage is still an opt-out sort of thing. You can still go through a divorce. Yes, it is difficult, but it is possible. And importantly, when during this opt-out mechanism, there are things and legal safeguards there to protect the most vulnerable individuals. For instance, if your husband is abusing you, the court of law recognizes this and grants you more protections. And importantly, you get alimony, maintenance, and custody over the children. This is something that is incredibly important. The counterfactual on their side of the house is that there's simply no measures of accountability because you are not legally bound to this individual. Men can leave the women after abusing them and after impregnating them. There's no money and no protection and no guarantee for these individuals. We think that that's necessarily worse. But on a more normal case, even when these things don't happen, understand that the mechanism of marriage that it is hard to opt out of is eventually something that is going to be beneficial, right? Because the human instinct fixates and overemphasizes very small conflicts. For instance, if you fight with your girlfriend, you feel like it's the end of the world and you want to break up. This mechanism of marriage, in fact, prevents people from walking out in the heat of the moment. It forces people to work through their problems in a way, and even if the problem is extremely insurmountable, or it seems as such at the point in time, marriage allows these individuals to gain certainty by saying that there's actually a lot of procedures that you have to go through before you can dissolve this relationship. Maybe you should think twice before doing so. We think that is beneficial because ultimately these individuals do love each other because they have entered into this union in the first place. We believe that the safeguards of marriage allows individuals to better realize their commitment to each other. Therefore, for all those reasons, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much for that, Leader of Opposition. We're building the case of the government, Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hello, can you... Oh man. Can you see me?
You're not visible on my end.
Oh, okay. Hello.
Okay, you're visible now and audible.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I posit to you that the average reasonable person likely possess in their individual capacity the fullest propensity for happiness. So we innately how to make like decisions regarding relationships and love or financial or legal decisions for ourselves. What marriage does is that it uniquely conflates these individual considerations into one, disabling people's capacity to make good decisions for themselves. How does this happen? I just want to dissect the different symbols of marriage and like what it means to different people in different contexts. This is also largely taking on our frame. The first is that it's a validation of true and committed relationship. A relationship is only valuable and committed insofar as I'm willing to say that I'll take on all of these financial considerations and burdens until I can actualize that relationship with that said individual. Secondly, it's a tool of security and financial empowerment. If it's the case that I want to move forward socioeconomically, it's a good thing that I get married because I can get like tax breaks or housing grants. Thirdly, in terms of like just actualization as a person, it seems as though it's an integral and important milestone in life. So if it's the case that I am 40 and have nothing to do with nothing to my name, maybe it's the case that getting married give me some kind of direction. I think the problem is that all of these are distinct considerations that should be actualized individually. They may overlap. So for example, your romantic partner may be also the person you want to cohabit with, but that's statistically unlikely. But we have that on our side of the house as well. What they do is that they disable the capacity for individuals to pursue these separate pursuits. So the comparative on our side is that what you can do is, you can, if it's the case that you want to express love, then you should look internally and self-actualize through, for example, signs of sacrifice or other meaningful acts that showcase that you actually care and are in fact committed to that person. If it's the case that you want financial security, then perhaps invest in like labor and pursue other endeavors. If it's the case that you want to protect yourself, then build connections or buy insurance, etc. Why is it the case that the comparative of packaging all of these concerns together terrible? The first is that it it cannot be an informed decision. And the reason for that is because oftentimes people are more moved by one constraint over the other. For example, if at the moment I am feeling the need for intimacy or happiness, what they force me to do is to trade off that off to opt into this system and then compromise my abilities to pursue other pursuits into the future. If it's the case that I feel unsafe, or if it's the case that I feel as though I don't have food onto the table, then what I am compelled to do now is also to sacrifice my capacity for individual happiness and pursuit of other suitors and partners for the exchange of marriage that can give me that monetary relief now. That is necessary entrapping. I'm not quite sure if it's the case that people can willingly inform themselves into this decision, given that a lot of the manifestation of impacts happens much later on, and arguably a lot of the times is done under duress. Second, I think the act and institution of marriage necessarily force these individuals to make compromises. So you're not able to do certain things as opposed to on the comparative. Let's weigh up these two mechanisms of actualization then. On their side of the house, they can just do the whole package as one. On our side of the house, we have to do multiple pursuits. I think the mitigation, the way in which you should weigh this up is mitigation of failure. It's unlikely to be the case, or it's highly unlikely to be the case, that the decision you make at that point in time will just work out in net because of the fact that, hey, a lot of the times marriages fail, up to 40%, and even those who stay in marriages are oftentimes unhappy. I guess if you're Asian, just like look at your parents and you can see plenty of things of like the fact that you're plenty of things that are wrong with the relationship, and how it's the case that they can be a lot happier if there's the case that they have parted ways. Maybe it's the case that on outside the house, people have a slightly harder time to actualize commitment in a relationship or spend a bit longer to actualize financial security, but the propensity for them to pursue and actualize the final potential of all these endeavors is drastically higher. Go ahead. QI.
So like, why can't these alternative arrangements also exist under our world? People can opt out of marriage still.
So I'm going to talk about that later, but just note that the institution itself is bad because it makes it so that it hinders your capacity to take on multiple pursuits in different areas. Like you're just forced into one. If it's the case that I enter it specifically for the financial reasons, I am kept out of the pursuit of other like romantic reasons. It might be the case that it works for some people, but these people are likely to just find that partner and then actualize all these endeavors individually anyway. Let's talk more about why is it the case that our conception of marriage is different from theirs. So they claim two things. The first thing they claim is that it's an informed decision. The second thing that they claim is that this is good because it allows states to offer protection. But I think these two things are not necessarily they cannot be tangent. And the reason for that is because I think states oftentimes have a tendency to pursue efficacy. So if it's the case that something is effective, they pursue it ruthlessly, which is why marriage seems to be the norm, and governments do whatever they can to compel people to enter marriages to lose themselves of the burden to take care of these individuals. For example, if it's the case that you committed an act of infidelity, somehow that's a ground for you to get like a better standing ground in terms of a divorce. If it's the case that you want housing grants, it's important that you stay together with a member of the opposite sex that then produce children. If it's the case that you want welfare for your children, a lot of the time is contingent on you being married first and foremost. I think it's true that marriage does create social utility. But the problem is that the government uses that social utility as incentive to make it so that people are forced to get married together. Then I think the media also like re-emphasizes conception. So it comes in forms of, for example, the fact that it's the happy days of your life, or like this is a sign as to whether it's the case that you are actually happy. Which is why you see, for example, people who have children and then get a shotgun marriage. It doesn't really make a lot of sense because of the fact that they're just very drastically ill-prepared and they clearly do not know what they want in life. But the instinct to get into that is automated because of the fact that the state oftentimes tell people that when you're lost or when you need security, get married and sacrifice your other lifetime potential for this security as of the moment. Additionally, what that means also is that the state is likely to make it so that it's as difficult for you to opt out. So the feasibility of opting out exists, but I want to posit to you that this feasibility exists when the state take into themselves the consideration and priority to make it so that they empower people towards their self-interest and pursuits anyway, right? So, for example, it's not the case that in each and every country, you have the pipeline towards divorce. In some countries, for example, the Philippines, it's just impossible for you to get a divorce. In a lot of religious countries, it's also drastically difficult. Aside from like the legal consideration, it's also about like the social consideration of it. But in all of these countries, they all protect marriages. So what that seems to imply is that if the state wants to go far enough and protect people, it is in fact able to without relying on the institution that is marriage. But oftentimes it uses marriage as a tool to bind these people together so that it can release itself of the duty to take care of these people. The last thing I want to talk about is why is it the case that the institution itself is just very exploitative and it's just a principle wrong. I think the reason why that is true is that it tapped into our basic instinct of intimacy And that's something that is very intimate and private unto ourselves. And it's something that we don't actually have a lot of control over, because sometimes when you just look at someone and you just fall in love, that's a fairly irrational decision. The state weaponizes the decision and say, if it's the case that you want to be that person who have access to intimacy and give the person you love what they ought to deserve, then you necessarily have to sacrifice yourself and open yourself up to all of these miscellaneous risks that is inevitable with the institution. For these reasons, we side with opposition.
Hear, hear. Thank you so much for that speech. Okay. Deputy Leader of Opposition, please.
Just give me a minute to set up. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Metric by which you need to weigh the impacts of this debate are based on the magnitude of impact in terms of the scale of benefit affecting individuals and the individuals that are likely to benefit on both sides of the house. So in our worst case scenario, even if we sacrifice some individuals by pressurizing them to get married, if that leads to wider societal benefits, we still win the debate. Because understand what Reiya tells you. If people get married and can afford to buy a house together, that means they are less reliant on the state for housing. If people who lose their jobs can rely on their partners for support, that means they are less reliant on the state for things like unemployment benefits. If more people have kids within the confines of marriage, that means you avoid problems like the aging population and you have workers in your country that can ensure you have economic activity. All of this doesn't just benefit the state, but also benefits people on the ground, at the point at which if middle class people are less reliant on the state has more resources available to give, for example, welfare to the poorest individuals on the ground. If there are more people working in your economy, that means you have more revenue generated, which can trickle down to the poorest people on the ground. This is an important impact that you need to weigh. So just because we don't benefit the individuals doesn't mean this is an impact that you can in fact discount. I'm going to talk to you about a few things in this speech. First, do people have the capacity to make a choice to get married? Khan says two things. One, he says you have no capacity to make the choice because you have state pressure. Notice there is no harm to this argument. Just because you might be pressured into this choice doesn't mean it's an inherently harmful choice, insofar as at the point at which you choose to get married, you assess the compatibility of you and the other person, and that's when you get married, right? So it means you have some ability to approximate what this person is likely to be. But also, if the individual changes very drastically over the course of the marriage and they become abusive, you have the ability to divorce them. And the state has an incentive to allow this, insofar as abusive relationships are in fact worse for kids as well. Secondly, they say that romanticism is likely to cloud your judgment. Sure, but at the point of it, but you don't just meet someone, fall in love with them, and get married immediately. Presumably, you date for a period of time, identify if you're compatible, and over that period of time, that initial romantic mist wears off, which means the point at which you actually get married, you're a lot more clear-headed to make that decision. That deals with choice. There is a capacity. Second question, on the state pressures. And here's where they say that marriage is bad because the state weaponizes marriage to achieve the state's own ends. Notice that the state's incentives to get people to have kids is symmetric because the benefits of preventing aging population and economic growth exist on both sides of the house. Marriage is just the current mechanism by which that goal is achieved. So in the absence of marriage, the state still has an incentive to discriminate against gay people, to discourage gay relationships, to give people baby bonuses, to get women to give up their careers, to spread the propaganda and indoctrinate people that having kids is likely to be good. That oppression is symmetric on both sides of the house. Marriage But the problem is it actually manifests in worse ways on their side. At the point at which you end up having kids outside of marriage, you used to have less legal protection. At least on our side of the house, when women have kids, there is a legal obligation for the husband to stay around and actually help to support the kids and actually help take care of the kids. And there are legal mechanisms that if the husband were to leave and get divorced, they have obligations to pay things like alimony and child support, which you don't get on their side of the house. So the state pressures to have kids is symmetric, but it's much worse for women on their side of the house. Finance. The third question that is about opting out. They say that women are going to be trapped in these relationships. But we think that's worse on government, because on government, you get like just regular romantic relationships, which you are still going to be dependent on your partner. The difference is you have no legal protection. So at the point at which you get divorced on our side of the house, at the very least, women get things like alimony, women get things like child support. They are not solely dependent on their partners. On their side, if you break up with your boyfriend, you get absolutely nothing, which means the financial pressure to stay in things like abusive relationships is much worse on their side of the house because there are no legal mechanisms to ensure these women are protected for. Now let's talk about the ability to gain happiness and meaning. And this is the final thing. The case here from DPM is that people have separate needs and they can't have one person fulfill all those needs. And somehow you have separate needs, you need to find different people to fulfill all those different needs. Even if you get married, you have alternative relationships, right? People have friends that they can turn to for things like company, for things like monetary support, for intellectual stimulation. This is unlikely to be a problem. But secondly, they don't actually mechanize as to why you are going to be able to find all those different people to help fulfill all those different needs on their side of the house. Because notice what they want. They want things like monetary support, intimacy, and all of those things. In order for somebody to be able to be willing to give you monetary support, they need to be able to get something from you as well, which means you need to presumably end up in some kind of sugar relationship on their side of the house, where you invest substantial time and money in that relationship in return for someone to give you the monetary support. The problem with diversification on their side is that you just have limited time, energy, and resources, and you can't spread yourself so thin as to invest in so many different relationships in order to get benefits from so many different people. You are unlikely to therefore be able to achieve anything. On our side, sure, maybe you don't get the fullest extent of intimacy or the fullest extent of financial support. By the point at which you get married, you often consider an ability to sort of get a balance, like to get these needs met to some extent. Insofar as you probably get married to someone who has a job and can to some extent financially support you or give you some level of intimacy. So we think those needs are likely to be met on our side of the house in a more balanced way. Yes, POI.
On one hand, you claim that marriage provides societal utility, but on the other hand, you claim that the incentive for governments to fix problems like aging population is symmetric.
Yeah. I don't understand this POI. Sorry. Like, yeah, governments have an incentive to ensure people have kids on both sides. Currently, they use marriage. In the absence of marriage, they'll just use other things, which is worse. Okay, let's talk about meaning then. Their claim is that on their side, people can define meaning in relationships. We think on our side of the house, you actually have a greater level of peace of mind because you marry the person you love and you know that they won't leave you, and therefore you can continue feeling that happiness. On side government, you have more stress because you fear that when you wake up in the morning, the person you love might have left you. You get more meaning, therefore, on our side of the house because you can focus on actually enjoying your relationship without worrying about whether the other person will leave you. You can actually invest in more shared experiences at the point at which you have certainty that the relationship will last a long period of time. The ROI on your investment into the relationship is guaranteed, which means you're more likely to actually make long-term commitments into the relationship, like buy a house together, have kids, invest in things like an expensive holiday, for example, and at the point at which you are sure that this person is going to be with you. That certainty is what allows you peace of mind to make the kind of investments that allow you to actually achieve meaning in your relationships. That is why we are very proud to oppose.
Chair here, thank you so much for that, Deputy Leader for Proposition. Rebuilding the case and crystallizing it for government. May I now call on Government Whip, please.
Their case is full of tensions. The first thing I want to do is to ask the question of which side makes relationships better. I want to start with weighing because all their benefits are only exclusive to privileged groups of people in society. Because as Lewan explains, most gender minorities, all women who can't give birth, all people who just can't get access to marriage don't benefit from any of the things that they talked about. Their main mechanism for why marriage is good for relationships is because it provides certainty and security, because people are predisposed to not being committed. The first response is that this is symmetric, because narratives of monogamy still exist, and if you love your partner and you feel meaning within that relationship, you're likely to stay with your partner and you're likely to be committed in that relationship. What is the conclusion of this analysis? It means that couples who aren't committed already see very little meaning, if not no meaning, within those relationships, which means to say that things like security and certainty don't matter insofar as couples don't see any value in that relationship already. But I want to point out, but the next thing they tell us is that it's easy to opt out of these kinds of relationships. It's easy to opt out of marriage because of things like divorce laws. And that was an attempt to try to symmetrize this debate. But on the other hand, they claim that you are guaranteed to have security and certainty within these relationships. It cannot be simultaneously true that it's easy to opt out of these relationships and true that you're able to get some level of security and certainty within that relationship in and of itself. What does this mean? It means that the more likely situation is that it's very difficult to opt out of this relation of marriage as a whole, because of the fact that the state places imposes some restrictions onto your ability to opt out through things like divorce laws, for instance. The question now is, are these laws good for people or by extension society as a whole? The case coming out from Litwin and Tan is very simple. At the point in which the state is involved in marriage, it restricts the ability of people to get other kinds of relationships that can benefit them, but it also creates narratives that are insidious to certain groups of people that particularly harm the most vulnerable groups of people in society, such as gender minorities or women, because of the fact that at the point where the state creates policies, for instance, that encourages people to have kids within a romantic relationship, is a point where you delegitimize the romantic relationships of other gendered minorities that exist within society. We give you several reasons why people cannot opt in. We explain that firstly, because of existing narratives that already exist that tells you that you need to have kids, it means that it forces people into marriage as a whole, making those relationships far more restrictive. Secondly, Tan really explains how the media naturally forces people to want to get married through things like narratives about the romanticization of marriage as a whole. But lastly, even things like forced marriages also still exist, right? The fact that there are arranged marriages that happen around the world. The other claim is that you can consent by nature of fiat. I want to give it to them. Maybe to an extent, you can consent to some degree. But the problem is that for most instances, there's just a higher likelihood of people being unable to consent towards a marriage, which means to say that most individuals enter marriages without proper foresight or proper knowledge about how their relationship might necessarily turn out. Before I continue, Kavindra.
So the fact that it's hard to opt out is a very reason why people are likely to be more considered in the way they decide to actually enter relationships on our side of the house.
No, because people tend to be rather short-termist because of the fact that the government creates policies that continuously entraps them in this situation where they have to get married. For instance, in Singapore, we give extra bonuses for individuals to buy certain public housing at the point where you get married, and that causes people to become short-termist and enter marriages in order to access public housing. That's how it's bad for people. Their way of trying to explain why this is good is to say that you can get investments within the relationship, be it buying a house or investing more into that particular relationship. The first thing I want to point out is that this is an additional reason as to why people cannot opt out of those relationships as a whole. But secondly, it creates a double harm situation. Because if you are unhappy in your relationship in the future, if it's the case that you rush into the relationship precisely because of the government policies that are tied towards marriage, it's a point in which you're stuck in two situations. Either you are forced to stay in that relationship and have an unhappy marriage. In that case, the net happiness of you as an individual fundamentally decreases, but it also impacts your family as a whole. Because if you have a kid, because their claim was that you are able to help children, you give children a better upbringing as a whole. But I want to note that if your family is one that's dysfunctional and happy with each other, it's just like the case that your child doesn't grow up in a happy family. It's better off that that child remains with a single mother that at the very least has a less argumentative household as a whole. But that's just one scenario. But the second scenario is that people opt out and so they get divorces, but the problem is that they lose out on all those investments that they place within that relationship. So for instance, people who divorce lose out on their deposits on their houses because they have to break apart their shared bank accounts, for instance. All that means is that you create further negative impacts for people who enter marriages as a whole, but that ruins their relationships as a result. And so people are generally far more unhappy. Let's then talk about weighing. We already explained why you harm minorities because of the fact that you reinforces narratives that romantic relationships ought to be heterosexual, or women are or suffer within their relationship because men just have an asymmetrical amount of power. I want to note that at the point in which these actors are far more vulnerable, we ought to prioritize them in the first place. Their way of trying to circumvent this whole problem was to firstly tell us that the state is able to get utility out of these policies. They symmetrize this debate by saying that things like baby bonuses also exist because the state is incentivized to do so. The first thing I want to note is that yes, things like baby bonuses and anti-aging population laws exist, but the difference here is that those resources go to the people who are the most proximate to those issues. So rather than baby bonuses going to both the husband and wife, in which the husband can co-opt most of that money, it now directly goes towards the women themselves, which means to say that they are able to more benefit from state government resources as a whole. But simultaneously, they also cannot claim that these things exist, but they're able to derive societal utility from marriage. But the derivation of societal utility is unique towards marriages as a whole. Last thing then, about why this is on both sides, we think that women are harmed to a certain extent. How do you weigh this up? There are claims that women are able to access things like divorce laws and be protected by the law. But we already explained to you why divorce, that is contingent on proving that divorce laws are even accessible in the first place. If you agree that in most instances, women are disenfranchised because of the patriarchy, because they don't have access to high-paying jobs, they don't even have the ability to access to a good lawyer, and often are worse off because of divorce laws as a whole. But the added harm is that they have even more restrictions in the inability to leave that relationship. Insofar as some women are protected by those laws, the comparison is that under our side, at least women are not subjected to forced gendered roles within that marriage, or they aren't forced to give birth in that marriage because they no longer see it as a fundamental investment into that relationship. So you help more women on net in this debate. Even if you think this is a wash, we still win on two outcomes in terms of guaranteeing more freedom and autonomy for people to choose their relationships, and also on the fact that we help just gender minorities as a whole. For these reasons, we propose.
Here. Thank you so much for that speech, Government Whip. Okay, concluding substantives for opposition. Opposition Whip.
POIs in chat. Humanity is weak and frail. We break up and leave these relationships too early. We give up and run away. We're afraid of commitment. And so what the institution of marriage does is creates expectations of duty and commitment. And it's a constant reminder that at the end of the day, someone loves you unconditionally. And it also provides protections for women, children, and the most vulnerable in the round. First question is on societal norms and who improves them. Their first claim is to say that the state indoctrinates everyone into believing that marriage is the be-all and end-all. Firstly, accountability mechanisms obviously exist over history and will continue to do so in the future. If the state is obviously accountable to the people, that means via policies of voting and getting our voice out, we can vote on which policies are actually good to enact, such as pushes for gay marriage in many, many countries around the world. But noticeably under this also, there also exists counter narratives of, people who don't want to get married. They talk about their stories. There are countervailing pressures that explain that you need to be very discerning when it comes to marrying, or do you need not marry altogether? Secondly, it is unclear that the state is meaningfully influential in the ways that they describe. Many instances, you don't particularly care about what your politicians or what your teachers say. Thirdly, it's just unclear that it's forceful because we describe mechanisms by which you can opt out of the institution of marriage altogether. All of the alternative arrangements that Fan talks about, like polyamorous relationships, like sleeping outside of your relationship, are not contingent upon you entering into this institution to begin with. Their response here is to say, aha, the government gives, housing subsidies to married couples. Firstly, the environment changing is not akin to coercing people into getting married. People are still going to be able to be procedurally rational within these sorts of choice environments and can still continue to assert their independence, even if the state is nudging them one way or another. No one is putting a gun to their head and saying, you can only get a house if you're married. You can still do a lot of the things that are important to agency when you're unmarried on the outside of the house. But secondly, just note that there's no direct harm here, right? You are less well off than other people, and worse, you're judged as a crazy cat lady, no direct harm comes onto your being. And noticeably, finally, I want to note, if indoctrination works in the ways that they describe, when they are happily married, and like it's absurd that they say it's exclusive to privileged groups, right? Everyone can get fucking married. So if everyone is happily married at the end of the day, and they can still find happiness at the end of their lives, even in their mildly dysfunctional relationships, there is still something to be proud of on our side. Then they say, their silver bullet here is to say, well, it's used as a tool of oppression. Firstly, they admit immediately that at the very least, it's good for children. If you weigh their vulnerability against adult gender minorities, I'm so sorry, like children are also pretty important. It's good that they grow up in a stable environment. But secondly, we highlighted from the beginning that the root cause of discrimination is independent from the institution of marriage in many instances. The patriarchy, gender norms, a lack of education within these areas are all things that are also bad for women and gender minorities on that side of the house and will still exist independent from marriage. We admit the worst case is that we do exacerbate gender norms in certain instances, we bite that bullet. But the difference here is that for lots of these women, at the very least, marriage offers protections. Wives and mothers within conservative societies have a certain status accorded to them on both a social and a moral and actually a legalistic level as well. We have divorce courts of alimony, custody, child payments, the family gets the dowry, and these are all going to be generally accepted in these societies if marriage is as important as everyone decides. So noticeably, it's just generally unclear what these protections will women and gender minorities have on that side of the house. I really don't know why women are able to freely leave these relationships under their paradigm, even if there isn't marriage, if men are indeed on top in these sorts of contexts. But noticeably, these things change over time. Minorities and women have always used marriage to advance these social causes. For instance, saying that gay people should also get married is a tool by which you can humanize them. On wing at the end of this clash, obviously marriage could sometimes entrap individuals, but this tendency reduces as a function of time. Unhappy people or unhappy groups of people in the institution of marriage campaign to change these sorts of narratives that have never been static. So people can always opt out. And ultimately, all of this means that we mitigate the bulk of their harms, which means that we get all of the benefits of certainty and commitment, which is my second question. Firstly, they say the state exploits desires for intimacy. I don't understand what this means. You don't need marriage to have sex and fuck. Secondly, society tells you because of the high threshold of exiting marriage that you ought to be discerning and not just with the man who's hot. You don't just marry him, right? And they say people cannot be discerning. I just genuinely think this is assertive. We have all of the education and all of these sorts of considerations that tell people that you need to marry someone who's good in bed, who's compatible with you, who's financially secure. So it's unclear why you can't get all of your individual, pursuits, your endeavors to self-actualization in your one partner, and then you put a ring on him and you marry him. Next, they say there is an increased chance of self-actualization if you don't conflate alternate individual desires. Firstly, Kavindra already highlights that the material benefits of pooling resources on a societal level is particularly important in generating aggregate happiness on net for the rest of society. These sorts of material comforts, even if they came in the worst case at the expense of individual fulfillment, were all generally important because they were near and dear. Making sure that kids can get raised in safe environments is honestly really important, particularly because things like individual fulfillments can still be fulfilled via things like hobbies, by friends, by food, by people who are in unhappy marriages or who are not married altogether. But secondly, and most importantly, we told you that for the people who were able to opt into marriage or who wanted to, they were going to become happier individuals because of the certainty of that commitment. PY before that.
If people who aren't committed no longer see value in are not committed because they no longer see value in that relationship, why is certainty and security beneficial?
Two things. First, they probably wouldn't get married. Usually you live together for some time before you get married. Two, this debate is not binary. You are not either committed or you're not committed. We explained that usually people are fickle and non-committal on that side of the house. There's always that gray area where you feel somewhat tempted by other beautiful people, where you're fearful of that commitment, or you're immature and you want to break up after an angry argument. So noticeably, what we do is that we set social and legal restrictions so that, yes, it is not easy to opt out, and that leads to happier long-term relationships because you're never scared as on that side of the house that the partner partner might leave you for another person. Game theory wise, if the other person can leave easily, that means that you don't want to commit because you don't want to be the one left holding the bag and feeling hurt. At the end of the day, growing old with someone is magically pure and beautiful. We're able to ensure that and is certain in the round. All of the things about social norms we can mitigate severely. Often marriage as an institution is able to better a lot of these norms. They have no alternative mechanism as to how they can flip the patriarchy, flip gender norms, and are better for minorities. Please oppose.
Here, thank you so much for that speech. Opposition whip. Before replies, let me just really quickly switch devices because my iPad is about to die. Oh.
Let me know when I can start.
Oh, okay. Ready. Opposition reply, please.
The weighing of this debate, if you notice the wording of the motion, isn't this house regrets marriage for the specific individuals who are harmed by marriage. This is about the overall society, and the magnitude of those benefits need to be weighed on the scale and on the individuals that are affected by this. What is the weighing here? Gov tells you three things. They said one, that on their side you don't oppress gender minorities, that on people are pressured to get married, and that women are pressured to have kids. Through down the opposition bench here, we've explained to you why these three outcomes are unlikely to be important. One, Gov doesn't explain to you why gender minorities are going to be better off on their side of the house, insofar as, like I said, states have an incentive to discourage gay relationships anyway, insofar as state has an incentive to ensure people have kids for economic benefits and aging population. Second, the pressure to have kids is likely to be symmetric for the same reasons. The only difference is that people have those kids outside of marriage, which is actually worse for women, at the point at which they don't get child support when their husbands leave them, but there's no legal obligation for the man to be around and actually help take care of the child. Thirdly, there is the issue of being pressured into getting married. Read your notes. At no point in the debate does Gov actually tell you why this pressure is likely to be bad. In the worst case, we tell you, if you get, for example, abused in your marriages, presumably the only real consequence of this of being pressured into getting married, you can actually get divorced. And there are legal protections like alimony that makes it financially sustainable for you to actually get divorced. So even in the worst case, the pressure to engage in relationships is going to be symmetric on both sides of the house. But at least in our case, if those relationships become really, really bad for you, you can leave it because you have financial protection to do so. On their side, you don't. This is important because this means that all of the impacts on their side of the house are severely mitigated and taken out, and therefore on a weighing of magnitude are unimportant. What are the impacts we give you on opposition? We talked about societal benefits. I get absolutely no response from side opposition all the way down the bench. We tell you it's how middle-class people can pool their resources and afford houses, which means they don't rely on the state for public housing, and public housing can be afforded to poor people. They can rely on their partner, for example, for support, which means they don't rely on the state for things like unemployment benefits, which means there's more money to give welfare to the poor. Kids grow up in stable households where they benefit from dual incomes and having father figures, which is important for them to both their welfare as well as the overall societal welfare of having kids that are more likely to be productive citizens. What is the weighing here then? Sure, gender minorities are vulnerable, but so are poor people, so are children. They are also vulnerable. So the weighing then cannot be on vulnerability, but on the magnitude of benefit and the number of people that are vulnerable people we benefit. On our side of the house, we benefit a greater number of vulnerable people than their side of the house. This weighing itself wins us the debate. But we also go further and talk to you about individual benefits that accrue from the fact that you are in a relationship that's hard to opt out of. One, we talked to you about how you get fulfillment at a point at which you are not stressed about actually losing the relationship. Two, about how you can actually invest in experiences because you are confident that the relationship will last longer. You can invest in things like kids or homes, all of which gives you more fulfillment on our side of the house. Three, that people can actually work through things like challenges and fights, and they don't just dissolve the relationship in the heat of the moment at the point at which they fight and end up regretting it. The fact that you are forced to go through divorce proceedings forces you to cool down and make a more rational decision at the point at which you are dissolving the relationship. All of this means is that both on a societal level as well as on an individual level, we give individuals a greater amount of happiness. We give individuals the ability to actually pursue fulfillment without the fear of losing the person that they love, without the fear that when you wake up in the morning, the person that you wanted to spend the rest of your life with is not there. The certainty and stability gives you peace of mind. But we also ensure that people have greater support systems, which benefits not only them, but also benefits society. Overall, on the magnitude of benefit and the scale of benefit, marriage is better than harmful. Thank you.
Here, here. Thank you so much for that. Okay, ending this debate, and I'll call on government reply, please.
Hello. Can I start? Just a verbal confirmation, anyone? Hello, hello. Check, check.
Oh, yes, you're audible now.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. When a woman faces difficulty in pursuing higher education or employment, in the presence of the institution of marriage that offers financial incentive and protection and is socialized to be normal and acceptable by the church and state, then they likely opt themselves in. This act, 1, diminishes the woman's potential to protest or pursue labor that would otherwise still grant her financial autonomy, even though it might be more structurally difficult if she was a man. 2, requires her to sacrifice the potential for happiness if she had taken more time to be more picky with another partner or choose someone better to cohabitate with or raise children with. 3, relinquish the state of a duty to provide opportunity and protect this particular individual. Opposition says this is not true because these women can work first. They can build a career, consider who if they want to be married with, date for a couple of years, and finally, if it's the case that they do get married, they have the resources and education to navigate the process of divorce. My response is this: I agree, but it's also the case that it scales down your benefits. Upwhip concedes to this. Some people do not get married or get married very late. It seems like for these people, they don't need the institution of marriage. So now there's a spectrum of women. I think what they do is that they give very little benefits to the already very privileged women who just like to do the things they would do anyway. And there's also very little harm because of the fact they have resources to protect themselves. They need then to engage with their worst case on the people who get married out of the fear of homelessness, or the people who marry because they are socially internalized to have children, or the people who marry because of the fact that they feel as though it's just the right thing to do the moment they are eligible for marriage itself. It's only then that the benefits of social benefits apply. And what that means is that they have to defend the worst cases of marriages. For example, arranged marriages, child marriages, and for example, like shotgun marriages. These marriages do not still satisfy all of their conditions for social utility and the fact that it offers protection, but it makes it so that it signifies the fact that they don't ever make the trade-off for the sacrifice in human potential and happiness. And they know what's up. There's a reason why they made the debates this way. The first thing is they know if it's the case that people are so desperate, then they cannot prove informedness. The second is that it's a shitty welfare system. What you do is that you take two poor people together and you say, hey, be responsible for one another, and now you've mitigated risk. Yes, it's better than if they were on their own, but surely it's not the right way to do it. Additionally, I think the state has capacity to actually empower individuals. So I'm not quite sure why it's the case that this is the particular best way to do so. Even if it's the case that it's just better than comparative, it's just not the auto-win condition because of the fact that it's likely to be the case that the state do things to help improve people's lives as a whole. They ought to do that instead of hiding behind the statistic as to why it's the case that there's just not a lot of homelessness people because of the fact they're just throwing poor people together. The third is I think there's actually no meaningful protection for women. They assert that the biggest protection is in the fact that men run away. And I'm not quite sure if it's the case that most women are concerned about the fact that their husbands are just disappearing. I think it's probably more painful, more hurtful, and more difficult to deal with the fact that in some countries, they don't recognize marital rape, or it's the case that domestic violence is just a lot harder to pinpoint indoors as opposed to someone assaulting you on the streets. Lastly, I think these women might not be that harmed without the institution of marriage. I think it's the case that there are some protection, but it's uncharitable to say that they can't, for example, work or seek legal protection elsewhere. It cannot be the case that these societies all just demonize and are out there to kill women, and that the only way for them to get some level of protection is through the institution of marriage itself. So when we look at the spectrum of cases and look at what is likely to be the middle ground, their case don't really apply. The final engagement that they have is on why is it the case that social util outweighs individual fulfillment. But I want to note that this win condition is not exactly clear. The first is it's not clear why it's the case that we automatically prioritize social util over individual fulfillment, given that a lot of the times social util is the means towards personal fulfillment. The second is DO did concede that states did still have an incentive to create children anyway, so likely they can do it through other means. But the capacity for you to get married or to submit like such a flash capacity of your life to one individual is usually finite and therefore much more impactful. Lastly, I just think it's like a shitty way of achieving social util. I think we do need to care about to what extent do we want to incentivize people to make decisions. It's pretty bad to prey upon their instincts of safety and intimacy to get them to do what we want. For all these reasons, please start with government.
Here. Thank you so much for a great round, everyone. You can go back to convening now, and then you'll know your decision by then. Once again, really great round.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.